The bringer of hope to his people, the leader of the nation through the Great Depression and World War II, and the 32nd president, this is the life of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, was born on January 30th, 1882, in a city known as Hyde Park that resided in the great state of New York. As a child, FDR lived with his parents, James and Sarah Ann Delano Roosevelt, in their luxurious estate in Hudson River Valley. As he was the only child in a rich household, he spent a large portion of his life sheltered within the walls of the estate. He was homeschooled by a series of tutors and lived by a very strict schedule. His schedule consisted of waking up at 7 a.m., eating breakfast at 8, lessons from 9 to 12, lunch at noon, lessons until 4, dinner at 6, and bedtime at 8. He was nearly never left unsupervised, and within his tightly packed day, he was only permitted 3 hours of free time. While living this type of lifestyle may sound suffocating, Roosevelt didn't mind. He was content with his structured life. Strangely enough, he once asked for a little more freedom, and his family granted him one single day. Now, instead of partying or playing video games during this free 24 hours, he spent his day idly walking around the estate, and when that day passed, according to his mother, he went contentedly back to his routine. Despite his uptight exterior, inside he was actually a mischievous child. One time, he put effervescent powder into the governess's chamber pot, or what is known as the toilet of the 1800s. When the governess started to use the chamber pot, it began to fizz. At the age of 14, FDR began attending Groton School for a highly respected ESPECIAL preparatory school in Massachusetts. In school, Roosevelt often focused his attention on pleasing adults and followed the teachings of Epcot Peabody, Groton's headmaster, who emphasized helping the less fortunate through public service. He graduated from Groton in 1900 and entered Harvard University, where he became a member of the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity, editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper, and received his degree in only 3 years. During his last year of Harvard, FDR became engaged to Eleanor Roosevelt, who just so happened to be his 5th cousin, once removed.
They got married on March 17, 1905. Afterwards, he attended Columbia University Law School for 2 years studying law. For the next 3 years, he practiced corporate law in New York, but found it boring and restrictive. So rather than spending the rest of his life as a lawyer, Roosevelt ran for New York State Senate in 1900, fighting for a Democratic seat. He won, and used his power to oppose elements of the Democratic political machine in New York. The Democratic political machine was a political organization in which a boss or political figure provided money or favors to poor people in return for political support. Even though this system seems fair on paper, most of the representatives who used this method were corrupt, cruel, and seemed suspiciously shady. FDR's attempts to stop this corrupt system gave him a good reputation and some experience in the political world. During this time, he met a man named Lewis Howe, an American reporter who would soon act as a mentor for FDR and help shape his political career over a span of 25 years. Even though he was second in command to his boss, Josephus Daniels, he still wanted to achieve more with his political career. So, in 1914, he did just that, by running for U.S. Senate in New York, although he lost by a landslide because of the little support he received from the White House. After that loss, he actually managed to find political success in a less political manner. By socializing at parties and forming many personal relationships, mostly with women, he made many reliable connections and gained popularity. However, one of those relationships almost destroyed his marriage, as he cheated on his wife with a woman named Lucy Mercer. His wife found out about his affair in 1918 and told him to stop seeing Miss Mercer or she would divorce him. He promised Eleanor that he would stop, and she stayed with him. However, he still continued the affair behind her back. Roosevelt's political career continued to flourish as time went on. In 1920, he accepted the nomination for vice president as John M. Cox was running for president. Cox lost the election, and in turn, so did Roosevelt. This loss wasn't all bad, for it provided Roosevelt with national exposure. After that, however, his life took a sharp turn for the worst. While on vacation, he was diagnosed with polio, a highly contagious disease that attacks the body's nervous system, and eventually he became paralyzed from the waist down. He began searching for all types of treatment, but found none that were successful. For a short period, he thought that his political career was over, but with encouragement from his wife Eleanor Roosevelt and his political confidant Lewis Howe, he continued his political career. Within the next few years, he worked to improve his health as well as to maintain his political image. He walked with braces and a cane, but made sure that the public never spotted him in a wheelchair. In addition, he worked to improve his relationship with the New York Democratic political machine. In 1924 and 1928, he appeared at the Democratic National Conventions, where he further increased his national exposure by nominating New York Governor Alfred Smith for president. In 1928, Al Smith convinced FDR to run for governor of New York. He barely won the election, but it largely boosted his confidence, and as the governor, he created new social programs.
In the 1930s, there was the Great Depression, and the people were blaming the Republicans for it. So he took the opportunity, since he was a Democrat, to run for president. Then, in November 1932, he beat Republican Herbert Hoover, making him the 32nd U.S. president, acquiring 57.4% of the popular vote. The people had high hopes of him, but his inaugural speech was what solidified his power. One of the famous quotes from his speech was, "Only thing we have to fear is fear itself." When he was elected, America was facing two major tragedies, the Great Depression and World War II. The Great Depression was a severe economic crisis that started in October 1929 when the stock market crashed. It was a worldwide tragedy that placed many Americans on edge. At the same time, Adolf Hitler's rise in power began to stir up talk of a war. America was at its lowest points when FDR became president. The people were desperate for any ray of hope they could get. His inauguration address was the first thing the people would hear from his as president, and he knew that above everything else, America needed a strong leader they could count on. The speech portrayed him as just that. It focused on his plan to declare war on Japan and to help overcome the Depression. He emphasized the need to be unafraid and do what it takes to overcome these trials, as their forefathers had. Once he was in office, he was faced with a huge dilemma. There were 13 million unemployed Americans, and hundreds of banks were closed. In the first 100 days, he promised to have economic reforms in what he called the New Deal. He formed deals with many companies like the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and the NRA, National Recovery Administration. These companies helped reduce food prices, employ young men, and regulate wages and prices. To most Americans, the New Deal was highly efficient and beneficial. Things began to go downhill in May of 1935 when the Supreme Court took down the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was a law that authorized the president to manage industry and to raise prices to keep the country from slipping from yet another Great Depression. Instead of surrendering, Roosevelt decided to enact a second New Deal that proposed several new concepts like the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations, which helped improve the U.S. By 1936, the economy gradually began to recover. The national product of the country was up around 34%, and the employment rate went down to 14%. With all the success, he still faced hardships in people believed that the country was moving towards socialism because of unbalanced budgets and an increase in government spending.
Also, many of the New Deal acts were revoked, and he failed in an attempt to bring it back with an assortment of pacts. Because the economy was still down and the bad taste the New Deal acts had left in many politicians' mouths, by 1938, Roosevelt had no power to pass more reform legislation. By the end of World War I, the Neutrality Acts, which prevented the U.S. from getting involved in foreign conflicts, was created. In the 1900s, he established a good neighbor policy with Latin America to try to improve relations with them. With World War II taking hold, Roosevelt found ways to help defend France and Britain from the Nazis. By the early 1940s, he announced that he was running for a third term of presidency. At the Democratic National Convention, he was nominated for president. In November 1940, he won, becoming the president for a third time, winning against Wendell Willkie. Franklin D. Roosevelt had factories turned into an arsenal of democracy for its allies, France, Britain, and Russia in 1941. He put his foot down against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. With support from Congress, he was able to increase the supplies to allies and expand the Army and Navy. The United States joined into World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A few months into the war, FDR ordered all people of Japanese descent to leave the West Coast due to Executive Order 9066. About 120,000 people were sent to camps during that time. Many of the Japanese Americans living in the West Coast had to quit their jobs, sell their property, and their businesses suffered a tremendous loss. Like the Jews in Germany, they were forced to leave their homes with just days to pack and were transported to their internment camps. He moved them because of racial prejudice along the West Coast against Japanese Americans. He felt pressured from the military and society, so he moved them in fear of a fight. After the war in 1988, FDR released the Japanese captives and gave the survivors of the camp restitution. He sometimes worked with the military as a military commander-in-chief and with his military advisors during World War II. Roosevelt contributed to a plan to defeat Germany that contained a series of invasions. The first one was in North Africa during November 1942, then Italy in 1943, lastly the D-Day invasion of Europe during 1944. Our U.S. allies helped defeat Japan. Also during the end of the war, there was a formation of the United Nations, which promotes world peace. By the end of the war, FDR's health took a turn for the worse. The hospital stated that he had atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, and congestive heart failure in March 1944. Even with his declining health, he decided to run for president again. He won again, being the only president serving 4 terms, with Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman as his running mate. In 1945, he went to the Yalta Conference to discuss post-war reorganization with Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet General Secretary. After that, he went to the sanctuary he bought called Warren Springs, located in Georgia. The one afternoon, on April 12, 1945, he died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage while getting his portrait done. As the painter painted, FDR is said to have complained about a severe headache before he collapsed on the floor. At his funeral, all of FDR's closest friends and family gathered to mourn the loss of their friend and president. His wife threw all of her energy into giving her husband a proper burial. Perhaps that is why she did not mind that Lucy Mercer Rutherford also attended.